The black car didn't belong on that street. Not on a block where the porch lights flickered, where half the mailboxes hung crooked on one hinge, where a third of the windows were patched with cardboard instead of glass, because heat cost too much and repairs cost more. Ethan Walsh watched it glide to the curb outside his building, the way you watch something beautiful and slightly wrong drift toward a place it clearly wasn't built for. A driver in a long black coat stepped out, walked around, and knocked on Ethan's door before Ethan had even finished pulling on yesterday's shirt. "Mr. Walsh?" the driver said. "Mr. Voss would like to see you." Ethan didn't know anyone named Voss. He was fairly sure he didn't owe anyone enough money to warrant a car like this. But then, it had been an unusual week. Ever since the coldest night of the year, 4 nights ago, when he'd given the last $20 in his pocket to a stranger on a bench and walked home expecting absolutely nothing in return. He had no idea that a folded-up bill and a pair of old gloves were about to change his whole life. And he had no idea at all who he'd actually been talking to. To understand how that happened, you have to go back 4 nights, to a diner parking lot at closing time, and a man nobody else in the city would stop for. Ethan Walsh was 35 years old, and most nights he smelled like a diner grill no matter how long he showered. He worked the closing shift at Rosie's, a 24-hour diner 2 blocks from the apartment he shared with his 8-year-old son, Jamie. Ethan's wife had left 3 winters ago. Not tragedy, just a slow unraveling that ended with a signature and an empty side of the closet, and since then it had been the 2 of them. A fold-out couch that was technically Jamie's bed, and a very careful kind of arithmetic that Ethan did in his head every single day. He'd grown up 2 neighborhoods over, in a building not so different from the one he lived in now, and he'd told himself for years that he'd be somewhere else by now. A house, a yard, the kind of stability his own childhood never quite had. Instead, there was this apartment, 3rd floor, a radiator that clanked like it was arguing with itself, even on the nights it worked, and a framed photo of Jamie's first birthday that Ethan still hadn't taken down even though his ex-wife was in half of it. Rent, groceries, the bus pass, and this month, worst of all, the heater. It had died on the first real cold snap of the year, some corroded part in the old wall unit that the landlord kept promising to look into. Ethan had priced the part himself online, $40, a size he could install with a wrench and a video tutorial, and had been setting aside whatever he could since. He was at $20. Payday was 5 days away. The forecast said the coldest night of the year was tonight. "Dad." Jamie appeared in the kitchen doorway in his coat, indoors, at 7 in the morning, which told Ethan everything about how the night had gone. "Is the heater guy coming today?" "Not today, bug." Ethan crouched to zip Jamie's coat the last inch. "Soon, though, I promise. You doing okay?" Jamie shrugged with the particular bravery of an 8-year-old who has decided not to make things harder for his dad. "I put on 2 shirts. Smart man." Ethan kissed the top of his head, the way he did every morning, the same way his own father never had. Jamie was small for 8, quick with a joke, quicker to notice when Ethan was pretending not to worry about something, which meant Ethan had gotten very good, over 3 years, at not letting his face give him away. "Grandma's got you after school. I'm working the close tonight, but I'll bring home pancakes tomorrow. Deal?" "Deal." Jamie held up a small fist. Ethan bumped it. It was, most days, enough. He pocketed the $20 bill, folded twice, tucked in the same spot every day, so he wouldn't spend it by accident on something smaller and stupider, and headed out into a cold that already felt like a warning. Rosie's Diner sat on a corner, 2 blocks from a highway on-ramp, the kind of place that never quite closed, even when the sign said it did. Ethan worked the grill. Priya worked the counter and the register and, on slow nights, whatever else needed doing. The manager, a heavy-set man named Roy who wore his keys on his belt like a badge of office, mostly worked the back office and his phone. The night went the way November nights went. A trickle of truckers, a couple splitting fries in the corner booth, the heater above the door blasting uselessly into a parking lot that had dropped, by 10 p.m., to 12 degrees. Priya was 26, worked doubles most weeks, and had a 4-year-old daughter of her own at home with Priya's sister, which was maybe why she noticed the old man on the bench before anyone else did. She had a habit of noticing the people other people had trained themselves to walk past. Roy had managed Rosie's for 6 years and treated the job the way some men treat a title rather than a duty, something that entitled him to comfort rather than something that asked anything of him. He wasn't cruel in the dramatic way. He was cruel in the smaller, more common way. the way of a man who has simply decided that certain problems aren't his to notice. That was when Priya noticed him. An old man, sitting on the bus bench across the lot, in a coat too thin for the wind, no hat, no gloves, hunched so far into himself he looked like he was trying to disappear. He'd been there since before her shift started. He hadn't moved. "Roy," Priya said, low, at the register. "That man's been out there over an hour. It's freezing." Roy didn't look up from his phone. "Not our problem, Priya. We're not a shelter. He's not asking for anything. He's just sitting there. Then he can sit somewhere that isn't in front of my diner, scaring off customers." Roy finally glanced up, saw Priya's face, and softened exactly as much as it cost him nothing to soften. "Look, if he's still there at close, somebody call the shelter hotline. That's the system. That's what it's for." Priya went out anyway, once, with a cup of coffee, and Roy intercepted her at the door. "I said leave it. Last thing we need is him deciding this is a place he can come every night." He took the coffee out of her hands and set it, pointedly, back on the counter. Priya didn't argue. She needed this job. But she watched the old man through the window for the rest of her shift, the way you watch something you can't fix and can't stop noticing. Ethan saw the whole thing from the grill. He said nothing at the time. Ethan had learned, in 3 years of near misses with rent, that arguing with the person who signs your paycheck rarely ends the way you want it to. But he didn't forget the old man on the bench either. Ethan clocked out a little after midnight, into a cold so sharp it felt physical, like walking into a wall. He pulled his own coat tighter, a good one actually, a gift from a life he used to have, and started the 10-minute walk home he'd made 1,000 times. The old man was still on the bench. Ethan almost walked past. He thought about Jamie, about the $20 in his pocket meant for a heater part, about how little room there was in his life right now for anyone else's problems. He got almost to the corner, and then, unbidden, he thought about a night 9 years ago, 19 years old, locked out of a dorm he could no longer afford, sitting on a curb in weather not much better than this, watching a dozen people walk past, without once slowing down. Nobody had stopped for him that night. He'd never forgotten exactly how that felt, the particular cold of being looked at like scenery. Then he turned around. "Hey." Ethan crouched down in front of the bench, so he wasn't looming. Up close, the man was older than he'd looked from inside, 70, maybe more. Deep lines, pale with cold, hands bare and shaking. "You okay out here?" "Fine," the old man said, in a voice that suggested he was very much not fine, and hadn't expected anyone to ask. "Just resting. It's 12 degrees. I've been colder. That's so. Once. A long time ago. Doesn't make tonight any warmer, though." The old man attempted something like a smile, and it cost him visibly to manage it. Ethan almost laughed, despite everything. "That's not really the flex you think it is." He pulled off his own gloves, thick, brown, worn soft at the palms, the only pair he owned, and held them out. "Here, take these." The old man looked at the gloves, then at Ethan, with an expression Ethan couldn't quite place. Surprise, maybe, or something older than surprise. "You don't have to do that, son. I know I don't." Ethan pressed them into his hands anyway. "Doesn't mean I shouldn't." He reached into his pocket, and there it was. The folded 20. The heater money. 5 days from payday, and no cushion behind it at all. He looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he held it out too. "Get somewhere warm tonight. A diner, a shelter, a bus that just drives in circles. I don't care. This should cover a night somewhere that isn't a bench. I can't take your money. You can, and you're going to, because I'm not leaving until you do." Ethan said it lightly, but he meant every word of it. "I've got a kid at home who's currently wearing 2 coats indoors, because our heater's broken. Trust me, I'm not made of extra cash. This isn't charity from some rich guy. It's $20 from a cook who clocked out an hour ago and still thinks you shouldn't freeze on a bench tonight." Something moved across the old man's face, something Ethan would only understand the size of much later. He took the money. He took the gloves. His hands, pulling them on, were shaking less already. Or maybe that was Ethan's imagination. "What's your name?" the old man asked. "Ethan." "Just Ethan?" "Ethan Walsh. I work at the diner behind you. If you ever need anything else." "What's yours?" The old man considered that for a moment, the way a man considers a door he isn't sure he wants to open. "Nate," he said finally. "People call me Nate." "Well, Nate, get warm. That's an order." Ethan stood, jammed his now empty hands into his coat pockets, and started walking. He didn't look back for a reaction. He hadn't done it for a reaction. He never once, in that entire conversation, considered that he might see the man again. The apartment was cold when Ethan got home. The particular, personal cold of a heater that has been broken for 6 days. And Jamie was asleep on the fold-out couch in his coat, one arm flung over the blanket, breathing in the small, even way that always made something in Ethan's chest hurt with love. His mother-in-law had left a note on the counter. He's fine, ate all his dinner, asked twice if the heater guy came yet. Love you, Elle. Ethan sat at the kitchen table for a minute in his work clothes, hands bare and cold, $20 poorer than he'd been that morning, and did the math again anyway, out of habit. 5 days to payday. No cushion. A heater part still $40 away. He didn't regret it. That surprised him a little. He thought he might lie awake doing the math on what he'd just given away. But instead, he found himself thinking about the old man's face when he'd taken the gloves. That flicker of something that wasn't quite gratitude, more like disbelief. Like a man who'd forgotten that people still did things like that. He thought, too, about his own father, who had never once in Ethan's childhood stopped the car for anyone standing on a highway shoulder, who used to say, "Not our problem," son, so often it had become a kind of family motto Ethan had spent his whole adult life quietly trying to unlearn. He wondered, briefly and without much heat, whether Jamie would grow up remembering a father who stopped, or one who didn't. It wasn't much of a question, when he put it that way. In the morning, Jamie found him at the table. "Where's your gloves?" Gave them to somebody who needed them more. Jamie considered this with the serious face of a child, deciding whether an answer makes sense. "Is the heater guy coming today?" "Not today, Bug." Ethan pulled him into a one-armed hug. Soon. He had absolutely no idea how soon. 4 nights later, on a cold, gray Tuesday morning, a black car pulled up outside Ethan's building, and a driver in a long black coat knocked on his door. "Mr. Walsh?" The driver was polite, unreadable. The kind of professional stillness Ethan associated with funeral homes or courtrooms. "Mr. Voss would like to speak with you. If you're able, I can drive you there now." "Who?" "Mr. Nathaniel Voss." The name meant absolutely nothing to Ethan, which was, in itself, exactly the point of the last 30 years of Nathaniel Voss's life. "Is this about a bill? Because I promise you, whatever it is, I don't have—" "It's not about a bill, sir." The driver almost smiled. "It's about a Tuesday night, 4 days ago. A bench, a pair of gloves." Ethan's stomach did something complicated. "Nate, Mr. Voss will explain everything himself. I promise you, you're not in any trouble. If anything," the driver added, glancing briefly at the cardboard taped over the window behind Ethan's shoulder. "It's the opposite." Ethan looked back at his apartment, at Jamie, who'd wandered out in his coat, wide-eyed at the sight of an actual black car parked on their actual street, and made a decision he would think about for the rest of his life. "Give me 5 minutes to call my mother-in-law," he said. "I need someone to watch my son." "Dad, is that a limo?" Jamie whispered, with the particular reverence of an 8-year-old encountering evidence of a different universe. "I genuinely don't know what that is, Bug." Ethan ruffled his hair. "Go get your coat off. It's not for us. I'll be back before dinner." He said it with more confidence than he felt. He had absolutely no idea, standing on that sidewalk, whether that was true. The building the car pulled up to occupied an entire block downtown, glass and steel and a lobby with a ceiling Ethan couldn't see the top of. He rode an elevator in silence with the driver and stepped out into an office with floor-to-ceiling windows and absolutely no visible logo anywhere, which somehow felt more intimidating than a giant one would have. The man behind the desk stood up as Ethan walked in. It took Ethan a full 3 seconds to place him. Clean now, silver hair combed, wearing a simple gray sweater instead of a thin coat, but the same deep lines around the eyes, the same face that had looked up at him from a freezing bus bench 4 nights ago. "Nate?" "Nathaniel Voss," the old man said. "I own this building, and 40 others like it. And, among other things, I own the diner you work at. Rosie's is part of a small chain my foundation quietly bought 2 years ago, as an investment in a neighborhood most investors had written off." Ethan sat down slowly, because his legs seemed to require it. "Every year," Nathaniel said, "on the coldest night of the year, I put on an old coat, and I sit somewhere in this city where people can see me freezing, alone, not asking for anything, and I watch what the city does. Why? Because 40 years ago, before any of this," he gestured, briefly, at the windows, the building, the life, "I was actually that man. Not a costume. A 26-year-old whose first company had just failed, whose apartment had just been repossessed, sitting on an actual bench, on an actual freezing night, in a coat exactly as thin as the one I wore last Tuesday, waiting to see if anyone in the world still had room for a stranger who had nothing left to offer them. He paused, and for a moment he wasn't a man in an office at all, but a much younger one, still sitting on that bench. A woman named Alba Reyes stopped. She had a paper bag with half a sandwich in it, and exactly $4, and she gave me both, and wrapped her own scarf around my neck, and told me, very firmly, to get somewhere warm before she called someone about it. I asked her name twice. She only told me once. I never saw her again. I looked, later, when I had the means to look properly, and I never found her. I spent the next 4 decades trying to build something worth what those $4 meant to me that particular night. He turned his hands over, palms up, as though the memory still weighed something. Every year since, on the coldest night of the year, I go back out, and I sit on a bench somewhere in this city, and I find out whether that kind of person still exists here. His eyes, steady on Ethan's, were unmistakably wet. This year, it was you. Nathaniel folded his hands on the desk. I should tell you, I don't do this alone. There are exterior cameras on most of the properties my foundation owns, including Rosie's parking lot. So I've seen the whole night, not just the 20 minutes you spent with me on that bench. Something in Ethan's chest went tight. Roy, Nathaniel confirmed, and his voice, though quiet, carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't a casual mention. Told an employee to leave a freezing man alone, rather than let her bring him a cup of coffee, twice, on camera, in a building I own. Are you going to fire him? I'm going to review him. Fairly. There's a difference. Nathaniel's tone was even, almost gentle. The tone of a man who had clearly made this decision before, more than once. I don't run this foundation on my temper, and I'm not going to start with a diner manager who had a bad night, being unkind to a stranger who, as far as he knew, really was just a stranger. If it's a pattern, and I suspect from what I've seen over 2 years of footage that it is, then he won't be managing a location I own. Not out of revenge, out of the plain fact that the job requires a kind of decency he apparently doesn't have when he thinks no one important is watching. He paused. The review decides that, not me being angry on your behalf. And Priya? Nathaniel's face changed at the name, warmed, the way it had when he'd first said the word Ethan. The young woman who tried to bring me coffee and got stopped twice? I've already had someone call her this morning. There's a scholarship fund my foundation runs for employees' children. She didn't know that when she tried to help a stranger for absolutely no reason. That's precisely the kind of thing it exists for. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. You're not punishing him for how he treated you specifically. No, Nathaniel said. That would make this about me. It was never about me. It's about what kind of place Rosie's is, when nobody important is sitting on the bench outside it. That's the only question that ever actually matters. He tapped the desk once, thoughtfully. The review board will pull 2 years of footage, not one night. They'll talk to every employee who's worked under him, not just Priya. If Roy gets a fair hearing, and it turns out this really was one bad night in an otherwise decent record, he keeps his job, and we never speak of tonight again. I would genuinely prefer that outcome. I don't enjoy any part of costing a man his living, but I've learned, over a great many winters, that people rarely get worse than they already were. The cold just tends to show you what was already there. As for you, Nathaniel said, and reached into a drawer. I believe you're missing a pair of gloves. He set them on the desk. Ethan's own gloves, cleaned, the worn brown leather conditioned soft again, exactly as he remembered them, except better cared for than he'd ever managed himself. I want you to have something else too, Nathaniel went on. Not because you asked for anything. You didn't. You gave a stranger your last $20 on the coldest night of the year, and walked home without so much as leaving your name for a thank you card. That's precisely why this matters. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside, a receipt marked paid in full for a wall heater repair. Not the $40 part Ethan had been saving for, but a full replacement unit, already scheduled for installation that afternoon. Beneath it, a second document, an offer letter, for a position managing community outreach for the Foundation's neighborhood diner properties. Steady hours, benefits, a salary that made Ethan's eyes sting in a way he wasn't prepared for in a stranger's office on a Tuesday morning. I don't want your money, Ethan said, and meant it, though his voice caught on the word money. It's not payment, Nathaniel said. I'm not buying what you did on that bench, You can't buy that, and I'd be a fool to try, and I've had 40 years to learn the difference. This is an offer to do, every day, for a paycheck, exactly the kind of thing you already do for free. Look after the people this city keeps forgetting to look after. You'd be extraordinarily good at it. I've had a lot of time to learn what that looks like in a person. Ethan looked at the folder for a long moment. The heater, paid in full. The job, his own gloves, cleaned and returned. Somehow more his than they'd ever been. This is a lot, Ethan said finally. I gave you $20 and a pair of gloves. This is, he gestured at the folder, unable to finish the sentence. This is not a trade, Nathaniel said. I want to be very clear about that, because I've watched money confuse this exact moment before, in other years, with other people. You didn't earn this by being kind to me. You'd have done the same thing for anyone on that bench, and I know that, because I watched you do it before you had any idea who I was. This is simply what happens when I find someone worth investing in properly. It would have happened whether I was the man on the bench or simply the man who reviewed the footage afterward. Can I think about it? You should, Nathaniel said, and something like respect crossed his face at the question. A man who thinks carefully before he says yes to things is exactly who I want managing this. Take the week. The heater installer comes this afternoon either way. That part isn't a negotiation. A boy shouldn't be wearing 2 coats indoors while I sit in an office with 3 empty rooms. Ethan took the job 2 days later. He didn't take it for the salary, though the salary changed things he hadn't let himself hope about in 3 years. He took it because on his first official day, walking the same 2 blocks he'd walked 1,000 times, he passed the same bus bench outside Rosie's, and understood, in a way he hadn't fully let himself feel before, exactly what he'd be doing every day from now on. Making sure that bench was never again a place where somebody sat alone at midnight, with nobody in the whole city willing to stop. The role turned out to be smaller and stranger than outreach coordinator had sounded on paper. Some weeks it meant walking the block at closing time, the way he always had, except now with a clipboard and an actual budget behind him. Other weeks it meant sitting with Nathaniel and a handful of shelter directors, arguing quietly about which corners of the city still had nobody watching them. He was not, it turned out, especially good at spreadsheets. He was very good at knowing which bench mattered. Roy's review took 3 weeks. It found a pattern. Not one bad night, but a small, quiet cruelty, repeated often enough that it had simply become how he ran the place when he thought no one was grading him for it. He didn't lose his job in a scene, or a shout, or a public firing. He lost it in a calm, documented meeting, the same way Nathaniel did everything, and was offered, notably, a real chance to reapply for a different role in 6 months if he wanted to show he'd learned something. Priya's daughter got her scholarship letter the following spring. Priya cried reading it at the counter, and this time, nobody told her to put the coffee down. Jamie got his heater back that same afternoon, and slept, for the first time in 2 weeks, without a coat. "Dad," he said, a few nights later, wrapped in a blanket on the actual warm couch, "why'd that rich man give us all this stuff?" Ethan thought about it for a long moment, about a bench and a folded 20 and a pair of gloves, and a woman named Alba Reyes 40 years ago, whom he'd never met and never would. "He didn't give it to us because we needed it," Ethan said finally. "Plenty of people need things. He gave it to us because I didn't know he could give us anything when I did something kind for him. That's the part that matters, Bug. Not the money, the not knowing." Jamie considered this with his familiar, serious 8-year-old face, then nodded like it made sense, and went back to his show, warm, for the first time in a long time, without having to think about it. Every year since, on the coldest night of the year, a certain bench, outside a certain diner, has 2 people sitting on it instead of 1. An old man in a thin coat, and a younger one beside him, both watching the same freezing street, both hoping, quietly, for the exact same thing to happen again. People had spent one whole life deciding who mattered based on a coat, a bench, a bare pair of hands. Somewhere, 40 years ago, a woman named Alba Reyes had once given a stranger $4 and a scarf and never learned what it grew into. Nathaniel Voss still looked for her, quietly, every so often, in whatever ways a man with his resources could look for someone who didn't want to be found. He hadn't found her yet. He hadn't stopped trying. In the end, the whole story came down to one plain fact, repeated every winter on that same bench. The money was never the point. The stopping was. He never did walk past. He never once had to be talked into it.